Good morning. First, I would like to thank the Trust for inviting me to speak this morning. It is an honor to address such a distinguished audience. I will be presenting on the Charleston Renaissance with a specific focus on the historic preservation movement, using the Charleston Museum's two historic museum houses as examples. But for context, we'll begin by exploring the Charleston Renaissance as a movement more broadly. By the end of the Civil War, Charleston was by any standard diminished. Large swaths of the city lay in ruins. The slave-based agricultural economy, which had once made Charleston one of the wealthiest cities in the nation, completely collapsed with the emancipation of the enslaved workforce. The war, which itself had begun with the opening shots on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861, devastated the city and its population, both enslaved and free. Although Sherman bypassed the city when he passed through the South later in the war, a devastating fire begun on December the 11th, 1861, believed to be accidental, left a large swath of the city as charred ruins shortly after it began. The following years of war and bombardment exacerbated the losses. Many of Charleston's commercial and domestic buildings were total losses, including some prominent ones. This photograph, probably from around 1860 or 61, shows Meeting Street and Institute Hall, where South Carolina met to leave the United States. Behind it, you can see the monumental circular Congregational Church, which housed Charleston's second oldest religious body, founded in 1681, in a building by Robert Mills, designed about 1806. The domed building stood without a steeple for some time before funding could be raised for its completion, inspiring the derisive lines that seem particularly appropriate for a Sunday morning audience. Charleston is a pious place, full of pious people. They built a church on Meeting Street, but could not raise the steeple. By the end of the war, this landscape had changed. Here we see how the same neighborhood emerged in 1865. The Mills-designed circular church emerged from the war as a Colosseum-like ruin. Many buildings were gone entirely, including Institute Hall next door. This famous image by Matthew Brady looks out at the post-war landscape from behind the fluted columns of the circular church ruins. To the west, the steeples of St. John's Lutheran Church and the Unitarian Church, both battered but still standing, are visible in the distance beyond the desolation. A similar scene reveals the ruins of the fairly young Roman Catholic Cathedral of St. Finbar on Broad Street, completed in 1854 to a design by P.C. Keeley, a student of England's famous A.W. Pugin. Again, same building from a slightly different angle. However, this view looking south down Meeting Street from the Mills House, past the fireproof building, towards St. Michael's Church, shows that all was not entirely lost. However, nature was not finished with Charleston. 2 decades after the end of the war, at 9:50 p.m. on August 31st, 1886, the Lowcountry began to shake. The 6.9 to 7.3 magnitude earthquake was the most powerful ever recorded on the east coast of the United States. Centered just north of Charleston, the earthquake was detected as far away as Boston and New Orleans. By the time it ended, some 2,000 buildings were lost or damaged, and many war-torn structures for which Charleston had fostered future hopes of restoring were finally written off, including the circular church mentioned earlier. We can see some of that damage recorded in photographs. Masonry buildings, like the houses seen here, sustained more damage than the more flexible timber frame structures, which is ironic because there had been campaigns to make more buildings masonry to help prevent fires in the past. That sort of backfired when an earthquake came. Here we see Randolph Hall at the College of Charleston, an addition on the west side facade lost. You can barely see ruins of the foundation on the left. St. Philip's Church, housing the city's oldest religious body and an impressive antebellum edifice, lost its west portico. Most of you visited that beautiful structure on Friday. The John Ravenel House on Charleston's waterfront East Battery sustained significant damage. It survived quite nicely, and as an aside, is for sale for $22 million if you're on the market. It's a beautiful house. Lastly, we see commercial buildings on Broad Street opened like a dollhouse. The devastation did not discriminate, however much the recovery may, with buildings all across the Low Country damaged and destroyed. And lastly, we'll leave the 19th century on this image, which shows a tent village of displaced Charlestonians living in Washington Square Park, their homes destroyed or unsafe. Although a few wealthy families were able to regain some financial stability with the discovery of phosphate along the Ashley River corridor, and many buildings were shored up and stabilized, this is the diminished condition in which Charleston limped into the 20th century. A shadow of its colonial and antebellum self when slavery, rice, indigo, and later cotton made it a social and economic powerhouse. Those days were gone, but as we will see, they were far from forgotten. Although efforts had been made to renew Charleston and find a way back into the national consciousness, the tepidly received South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition in 1901 being a good example of those efforts, an actual renaissance would be some years down the road. The construction of the Navy Yard north of the city helped buoy the economy, but the arts would put Charleston back on the map. Charleston's rebirth, what we now call the Charleston Renaissance, lasted from approximately 1915 to 1940. The period saw a renewal of the visual arts and performing arts, appreciation and preservation of the region's historic architecture and built environment, and a renewed appreciation for the overall culture of the South Carolina Low Country, the things that made the region unique, at least in a 20th century mind. The art produced in this time by artists such as Elizabeth O'Neill Verner, Alice Ravenel Hugh Smith, Alfred Huddy, Anna Hayward Taylor, and many others helped shape a new vision of Old Charleston. Prominent artists of national prominence, such as Andrew Wyeth, spent time here capturing the alluring beauty of Charleston's ancient landscapes as well. However, as we will see, no matter how modern the artistic expression, fundamentally, the Charleston Renaissance provided a new way of looking at old things. It was a process of commodification through which the city of Charleston was fashioned into a marketable concept, one that would reshape the Low Country's economy, its view of itself, and the face it showed the world. Of the many talented artists that shaped the period, I find Elizabeth O'Neill Verner's work most compelling. Her paintings and popular etchings cast the city in a particularly alluring, if somewhat hazy light. Charleston's historic architecture features prominently. This view shows the famous Simmons Edwards House on Legree Street, popularly known as the Pineapple Gates House. The house was built for Johns Island planner John Simmons at the turn of the 19th century. The famous gate piers were topped with carved finials, most likely depicting Italian pine cones, date to the occupancy of the house's second owner, George Edwards, who acquired the property in 1816. You probably noticed this house when you were on Legree Street for lunch quite recently. Here we have a southerly view through the portico of St. Michael's Church, which most of you visited on Friday. Other than the colonial architectural grandeur, this view is also notable for the figure dwarfed by the monumental columns. Many such etchings by Verner and/or contemporaries populate their scenes with African American figures. These can include pedestrians, street vendors, market workers, and domestic servants, among others, all very much typical of early 20th century Charleston and its worldview, which had not changed since what is still sometimes referred to as the recent unpleasantness of the Civil War. It was picturesque, but not in any way just. This 1928 view shows the famous Meeting Street gates of St. Michael's Churchyard as viewed from within. Here we see St. Michael's steeple from the south, viewed beneath the portico of South Carolina Society Hall. Begun in 1803 to a design by Charlestonian Gabriel Manigault, the prominent portico which shelters the sidewalk was added in the 1820s. Not all etchings were architectural. or landscapes. Some, like this example by Alfred Huddy, features a woman and is labeled Phyllis number 12. One assumes there were Phyllises number 1 through 11. And features the same figure shown in detail in another work. Werner completed a similar depiction in 1925, this time showing a figure labeled as Mama Tina, shown nursing a bundled baby. No matter if it was historic architecture like this view featuring St. Philip's Church steeple rising above the rooftops, Edward Brickell White's pinnacled French Huguenot church, which you also got to visit, the famous pink house on cobblestone paved Chalmers Street, are figures like Mom Linda. The art of the Charleston Renaissance paints the city in a light that harkens back to the perceived glory and flawed values of its colonial and antebellum glory days. Beyond the ubiquitous etchings, other examples of Renaissance art include original paintings like those seen here by Werner, who stands by as customers examine her work displayed on the gates of St. Philip's Church on Church Street. Other examples were much more monumental, like Alfred Huddy's depiction of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, which originally hung in the Fort Sumter Hotel overlooking White Point Gardens, but now occupies a wall in the Wilcox Auditorium at the Charleston Museum. In addition to this painting and a large collection of prints and etchings, the museum also cares for other original works and artifacts from the period, including this original oil on canvas depicting the now lost S.I. Tupper House by Richard Jenkins Bryan, these art tiles by Anna Hayward Taylor, beautiful examples that a lot of people are surprised to find that Taylor was actually doing pottery tiles, but they're gorgeous examples donated by the artist. The sign from Elizabeth O'Neill Werner's Trad Street Gallery, and not least of all, the piano upon which George Gershwin composed Porgy and Bess. He rented it from Charleston Siegling Music House while he was staying at Folly Beach in the summer of 1934. However, the most enduring legacy of the Charleston Renaissance, in my opinion, is the historic preservation movement, which fostered renewed interest in preserving and restoring Charleston's historic built environment. In this regard, the post-war poverty that had befallen the city had aided in the survival of old buildings. Few could afford to replace them, so many survived. I will give particular attention to the two houses whose contents I am honored to curate, the Hayward Washington House, built in 1772, and the Joseph Manigault House, built in 1803. The present Georgian double house at 87 Church Street, at least the third to occupy the site, although I hold out hope that Sarah and her friends can find me a 17th century house there someday, was constructed in 1772 by Colonel Daniel Hayward, a very wealthy low country rice planter. It was soon deeded to his son, Thomas Hayward, Jr., a London-trained attorney recently returned to the colony after completing his studies at the Middle Temple. He would grow to fame as one of South Carolina's four signers of the Declaration of Independence. After the American Revolution, Hayward continued to own the house while living nearby on Meeting Street, leasing the Church Street property. Its most famous lodger at that time was George Washington, who stayed in May 1791 during his southern tour. If you believe every site that claims Washington slept here, you think the poor man had narcolepsy. But we have receipts. He actually stayed at the Hayward Washington house. In 1794, Hayward sold the house to John Faucherard Grimke, who is not as well known to history as two of his daughters, Sarah and Angelina, two vociferous abolitionists and suffragists. One can imagine their views did not make them particularly popular to Charleston society, here in the capital of American slavery. The house was next purchased by Margaret Monroe and left to her granddaughter, Elizabeth Trott, in whose family it stayed until 1883. At that time, it was purchased by Henry Fusler, who operated a bakery from the property into the 1920s. The Fuslers were responsible for an invasive retrofit of the house for commercial purposes. Prepare yourself, it's violent. The ground floor was lowered down to street level, and a large storefront was built into the southeast corner of the house. Luckily for posterity, the second floor survived relatively unaltered. This is how the house looked through the 1920s. At a time when many Charleston interiors were being stripped and relocated to museums and private collections elsewhere in the United States, rumor reached the Charleston Museum that an outsider, one of the most egregious offensives someone could have in Charleston is being from off, had their eyes on the drawing room millwork of the Hayward Washington House. With the help of the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings, now the Preservation Society of Charleston, who helped raise the money, the Charleston Museum purchased the house in 1929 for $27,500. The Society of the Cincinnati contributed $2,500 towards the down payment in exchange for a place to meet in perpetuity. Looking back, that may be the worst deal in the history of deals, but they are still present in the carriage house at the Hayward Washington House. That's why it's not open to the public, because the Society of the Cincinnati still meet there on the property. In 1953, Historic Charleston Foundation helped by paying off the last $1,500 on the mortgage on behalf of the museum. The 1929 to 1930 restoration was conducted by famed Charleston architect Albert Simmons, who restored the original 5-bay facade to its pre-Fusler appearance, raised the first floor back to its original height, and restored the first floor plan based on evidence surviving in the ceiling joists. Simmons utilized 18th century material to replace losses from the Fusler era. The house opened to the public in 1930 and is South Carolina's first museum house. It was named to the National Register in 1978. As much as we owe to Albert Simmons, he was a fantastic preservationist, especially for this period in the 20th century. If I ever get a time machine, I'm going to go back in time and give him a camera, because he did not document what he started with, which you'll see in a minute. I had help from another figure from the period later. So this is the Hayward Washington House as it appeared roughly around the time the museum acquired it. The door had been moved over one bay to the right and lowered down to street level, given a random sort of Italianate-looking hood and this horribly offensive storefront. This is the most famous picture. It's jarring. I'm still not over it. Luckily, upstairs, despite all the Victorian tat, survived relatively unaltered. The drawing room, known for its woodwork, is really what had the house at risk. It's the only unusually good room in this house. The rest of the house is actually kind of plain, sort of a mid-grade house for the period in Charleston, especially considering the wealth of the family that lived here. But this is the Fusler era. And this is after the museum acquired it. There were years of debate over whether or not this mahogany overmantel was painted. It's currently painted again, although it was mahogany in that view. The house has traditionally served as something of a furniture museum for the Charleston Museum's collection of period furnishings. These are some of the most spectacular examples: a famous tea table in the Chippendale style and two side chairs. The two side chairs have a provenance to the lost Archdale Hall plantation. The tea table has a very similar cousin out at Middleton Place, so possibly from different craftsmen in the same large shop. But I recommend going and seeing them both. The quality is a little bit different on them, but obviously one may have been made from the memory or the pattern of the other. Here we see a bedroom, the best bedroom as we call it, a Jeremiah Theus of Mrs. Hayward above the fireplace, a view from the drawing room into what is now the withdrawing room. At that time, it was interpreted as a bedroom, possibly the one Washington used when he was there, of course. One of the unique things about the Hayward Washington House that Sarah touched on is the intact dependencies. The kitchen house, which contains laundry and kitchen on the ground floor and enslaved quarters on the second and third floor. Kitchen houses are not uncommon in Charleston. Many survive, but most have been gutted and tied into the house with hyphens. So having this structure intact is very special, and it makes this property very special. Just kind of some early photographs. This may be one of Elaine's excavations, yeah. Inside the kitchen house, this is an early view. We'll see a more current one in just a moment. Looking out from the third floor, there is a intact privy or necessary in the garden, which, by the way, is still our public restroom. We put a toilet in it, don't worry. The garden, beautiful 18th century style garden. It contains plants that are documented to have been in Charleston by Washington's visit in 1791, laid out by Emma Richardson, who was the assistant of the museum director at the time, and the carriage house, which is now the headquarters of the South Carolina branch of the Society of the Cincinnati. And some more of the garden along the way. I encourage you to go visit the Hayward Washington House. It is open this afternoon and tomorrow. Here's some current pictures. As I mentioned, the house has traditionally been used by the museum as a place to display its imported furniture collection. We're trying to incrementally get out of that mode and interpret the interiors appropriately and authentically. So some of the things here are slated to be taken out in the not too distant future. We're working with Natalie Larson on a soft furnishing plan for this house, starting with the drawing room, window treatments. The table is set rather aggressively, I'll admit, but we got a little carried away. The Chinese export descended in the Daniel Ravenel family of Wantu Plantation, but the food on the table is based on the archaeological record from the site. And it's also currently represented in preparation in the kitchen house. So we're really proud of this level of interpretation. Martha Zierden, who was our recently retired curator of historical archaeology, applied for a grant, and we were able to utilize some of the research from the archaeological record. So we're really proud of that, that we can point to this dish, was here. It's easier with, meat dishes, obviously, because vegetable dishes don't really survive in the archaeological record much, but we did use Mylar on the good china, don't worry. And that lovely monument of a thing in the middle is supposed to be a pigeon pie. I don't know how many pigeons one would have to kill to make a pie that big. And of course, as Tom Savage touched on in his opening remarks, the Holmes bookcase, the most famous object in the house and one of the best pieces of 18th century furniture in existence from America. And the clock, which I will save for its own talk in another day. And again, the best bedroom as it looks today, and what we call the white bedroom with a spectacular Jeremiah Theus portrait over the fireplace. And the kitchen, this is actually the most recent stock photo I have of the kitchen, but it does not show the new interpretation as far as the foodways goes. And the garden, which absolutely shines in the morning sunlight. I am fortunate enough to have a drone, so I took these. If I ever get up in the early morning, you know I'm out with the drone somewhere. But the completeness of the site is really one of the things that sets the Hayward Washington House property apart. So even today, much of how the wider world views Charleston is shaped or colored by the lens of the Charleston Renaissance, which first introduced the city to a larger national and international 20th and 21st century audience. Although the Charleston Renaissance represented the city's attempt to lean into a prosperous future, it was decidedly backward-looking. The art of Werner, Huddy, and the contemporaries took Charleston's ancient picturesque streetscapes to audiences beyond the Low Country, and museum houses like the Hayward Washington House and our other house, the Joseph Mango House, which I didn't have time to cover, gave them ways to experience the city's past, or at least a particular version of that past, when they visited, as so many would. In the Charleston Renaissance, the city's past became the key to its future, and in many ways that still shapes what preservationists continue to do today. We look forward at the past, balancing our rich, complicated, often painful, sometimes beautiful histories for public consumption.